For almost 100 years after Christopher Columbus made his famous voyage, the most powerful empires in the world looked at the vast, resource-rich landmass of North America and ignored it. This early map shows the speculative nature of cartography at the time. Columbus's discovery was actually a correction of existing charts that already showed land to the west based on Viking reports. Mapmakers just didn't realize they were looking at a massive, unbroken continent. This map of the Caribbean shows where Columbus actually landed. He expected to reach the silk and spice trade routes of Asia by sailing west. Instead, he found islands with no spices, no silk, and no clear path to the east. But he did find gold, which recalibrated Spain's entire strategy. At the time, Spain and Portugal had divided the non-Christian world between themselves. Portugal took the eastern routes around Africa to build an Asian trading empire. Spain took the west and immediately began conquering it. The Spanish pushed northward, launching a major expedition deep into North America in 1539. They marched through the wilderness, expecting to find the same sprawling, gold-rich empires they had discovered in the south. They found nothing. Following that failure, the Spanish crown labeled the entire North American interior useless. They abandoned the territory for decades because it lacked immediate, extractable mineral wealth. To a 16th-century European king, value was defined by gold. Because North America didn't offer a quick payout, it remained the land nobody wanted. England reached the continent 16 years before Spain even discovered Florida, but they also let the land sit untouched for a century. Like the Spanish, the English were looking for a quick fortune, not a long-term colony. Their first attempt at settlement in 1585 ended in total failure. The colony at Roanoke, North Carolina, mysteriously vanished, leaving behind only a single word carved into a wooden post. Decades later, the Pilgrims arrived. These were radical religious isolationists who established a society so strict they outlawed common social staples like gambling and even the celebration of Christmas. These communities represent a pivot in imperial strategy. Instead of sending transient soldiers to search for gold, England began shipping entire families across the Atlantic to clear forests, build towns, and establish permanent roots. This map of La Nouvelle France shows the geopolitical reality of the era. While the English anchored themselves to the coast, France claimed the entire middle of the continent, a vast territory stretching toward the Great Lakes. That sprawling French territory held a total population of just 60,000 people. The narrow strip of British colonies along the coast held over 1 million. Demographics were effectively rewriting the map. The high population density in the British colonies was transforming the worthless coast into a productive, high-leverage asset for the empire. You can only pack so many people into a narrow coastline before they start pushing inland. By 1754, that pressure triggered a direct collision with French-held territory. The ensuing French and Indian War involved a complex web of alliances between European powers and indigenous tribes. It was a brutal struggle for control over the very land Spain had once labeled useless. Britain won a decisive victory. In the peace treaty that followed, the French presence in North America was systematically dismantled and partitioned. This map shows the division of the spoils. France gave half of Louisiana to Spain, while the other half, along with the entirety of Canada, was handed to Britain. Britain now owned almost the entire continent. But fighting a global war thousands of miles from home had drained the treasury, leaving the empire on the verge of bankruptcy. They finally controlled the land nobody wanted, but the immense cost of governing and defending that new territory led to the heavy taxation that would spark
Britain had just won control of the North American continent, but that victory came with a massive price tag: wars run on credit. And to pay down their spiraling debt, the British Crown looked across the Atlantic to their American colonies for the cash. The colonists had fought and sacrificed alongside the British. Now they were being hit with new taxes and sweeping mandates from a parliament where they didn't hold a single seat. They were being billed by a government that gave them absolutely no voice. That disagreement escalated quickly. Protests turned into armed standoffs, and those standoffs snowballed into a revolution. By July of 1776, the colonies officially severed their ties with the British Empire. But writing a declaration doesn't create a country. It took 5 brutal years of armed conflict against the British military to actually secure that independence on the ground. The end of the war revealed a critical flaw. The 13 colonies were functioning as 13 separate countries. United only in name, this loose alliance was failing fast as each state pursued its own competing interests without a central authority to guide them. To survive, the founders had to scrap the original design and reboot the entire system. They drafted a constitution that bound those separate states together under a powerful, centralized federal government. That document kept the American experiment alive. But even with a stable government, the United States remained a small, vulnerable nation, completely boxed in by powerful European empires claiming the rest of the continent. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon Bonaparte was mapping out a sprawling French empire in the Americas. He even secured the rights to the massive Louisiana territory to serve as its foundation. But Napoleon had a pressing problem. He needed immediate cash to fight a war against Britain. Realizing he couldn't afford to defend an overseas colony anyway, he made a decision that shocked his own advisors. He offered to sell his entire North American claim to the United States. This map shows the scale of that transaction. For $15 million, America bought the entire Louisiana territory, instantly doubling the physical size of the country in a single stroke. This graph charts the demographic explosion happening inside the country at the exact same time. The American population was doubling every 20 years. Families were massive, often with 7 or more children, and all of those people needed farmland to survive. For a nation doubling its population every 20 years, expansion was a biological requirement. Families with 7 children needed farmland, making westward movement the only viable path forward. Driven by that relentless population pressure, the United States launched into a 50-year sprint to push its borders all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They used every diplomatic tool available. They purchased Florida from Spain in 1819 and watched as Texas fought for its independence from Mexico before absorbing it a decade later. When opportunism wasn't enough, they used force. They hammered out a hard-fought treaty with Britain over the Oregon Territory and fought a devastating war with Mexico to conquer the vast northern territories. Through purchases, treaties, and conquest, America achieved unbroken continental dominance from coast to coast in 50 years. Every new Western territory acted as a wedge, driving north and south toward fatal internal rupture. Continental expansion provided the fuel for a catastrophic tension over slavery that was about to ignite. The country was operating on 2 completely incompatible economic engines. The northern states had abolished slavery and ran on free labor, while the southern states built their immense wealth on an agricultural economy strictly dependent on enslaved human beings. The massive influx of new Western land forced an unanswerable question. Every time a territory was added, politicians bitterly fought over whether the new soil would be free or if it would allow slavery. The fragile balance finally shattered in 1860. The election of Abraham Lincoln signaled to the southern states that the expansion of their slave-based economy was over and that total abolition was inevitable. Refusing to accept that outcome, the majority of the slave states seceded to form their own breakaway republic. What followed was 4 years of combat, resulting in the deadliest war the American continent had ever seen. The Civil War proved that a nation cannot continuously conquer territory and scale its borders without eventually having to answer for the moral and economic contradictions rotting at its foundation. Ultimately, the industrial might of the North overwhelmed the South. The Union won, forcibly stitching the shattered pieces of the country back together. But the most significant outcome of that bloodshed is codified right here. This document shows the 13th Amendment, making the destruction of the institution of slavery absolute under the law. Securing that change required a massive political push, cemented into the nation's framework by the hundreds of signatures carefully collected across this page. America had survived its chaotic birth and violently purged its foundational sin. The nation was bleeding and exhausted, but it was intact, and somehow, in the wake of all that destruction, this continental empire was about—
In April 1865, Abraham Lincoln was dead. The United States was severely traumatized, broken by civil war, and focused entirely on its own fragile survival. On the exact same night Lincoln was killed, his Secretary of State, William Seward, was stabbed and left for dead, but Seward survived. Almost immediately upon recovering, a Russian diplomat approached him with a strange proposition:
Russia wanted to sell Alaska. Seward moved with almost comical speed. When Russia asked for $7 million, Seward countered with $5 million, and they closed the deal that same night. The American press tore him apart. They attacked the purchase as a useless frozen wasteland, branding it Seward's Folly and a massive national embarrassment. But look at the sheer scale on this map. Alaska added nearly 600,000 square miles to the United States. More importantly, look where it sits. Controlling the absolute top of the Pacific, it provided a massive northern shield in an increasingly dangerous world. By purchasing that frozen landmass, America took an intentional first step toward building a multi-ocean buffer, pushing the nation's defense far beyond its own continental borders. Further south, American businessmen had seized control of the Hawaiian Islands, seeking to overthrow the local leadership and begging Washington to annex the territory. The sitting president flatly refused. He argued that America had to remain a republic that respected weaker states, refusing to use military weight to claim the islands. But this map illustrates the strategic reality. If Hawaii remained independent, it invited rival empires like Germany or Japan to move in first. Those islands would become an enemy base. Without them, the American West Coast sat completely exposed. Washington was paralyzed by the choice between remaining a republic or becoming an empire. That debate sat completely unresolved until a crisis across the continent forced a decision. Over in the Atlantic, Cuba was engaged in a brutal war for independence from Spain, fighting to break free from the last major remnants of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Americans were watching with sympathy, but that quickly turned to violent outrage when a United States warship mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor. Washington ordered Spain out of Cuba. Spain declared war in response. The resulting conflict was incredibly brief, lasting just 4 months. This map highlights the spoils of that rapid victory. When the fighting stopped, America took control of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Atlantic and the Philippines in the Pacific. Under the cover of war, Congress quietly annexed the Hawaiian Islands, too. In just 4 months, the Spanish Empire that Christopher Columbus had built 4 centuries earlier was effectively dismantled. By choosing to hold these territories indefinitely, the United States moved past its strictly continental focus to establish a permanent global presence. Following another presidential assassination, a ruthlessly energetic man named Theodore Roosevelt inherited this sprawling new domain. Roosevelt's priority was the Navy. He rapidly built the second-largest fleet in the world, turning the ocean into a platform for American influence across the globe. This map shows his geographic flaw, a navy split in 2. Moving ships between oceans required a weeks-long journey around South America. When Colombia refused a shortcut, Roosevelt helped Panama form an independent country in exchange for the land to build a canal. The Panama Canal officially opened for traffic in 1914, the exact same year that the First World War erupted across Europe. Through a deliberate chain of acquisitions, from the frozen edges of Alaska to the strategic depths of the Pacific and a severed isthmus in Central America, a collection of squabbling colonies had engineered itself into a locked-down, 2-ocean superpower ready to define the 20th